The death of reading is not some distant future prospect. It's already here. That's roughly the argument that Rose Horwich made in her recently published article in The Atlantic under the foreboding title, "The End of Reading is Here." A lot of people are debating and discussing this article, and in particular, whether or not Horwich has an accurate read on the situation, whether or not we really are living in a post-literate society, whether or not reading is, in fact, coming to an end. But I don't think that the main value in the article is actually found in that overarching thesis. I think it's found in some of the particulars that Horwich successfully points our attention to. And so what I want to do today is draw out what I think are the 4 key takeaways from the article. And what I want to do with those is use them to point us to action. So rather than this becoming just another video talking about how we have all these problems with reading and we're not doing it well, not doing it enough, and so on, I want to talk about what we can do differently. Because I think there are actually quite a few things that we can do. There are some things that are pretty easy to do that could make a pretty big difference. The first main idea is that reading has transformed society for the better by changing our capacity for thought and expression. And this isn't something that's just happened on an individual level for you and for me as readers, but something that comes to inform and shape our communities and our culture broadly, and even all the way up to our country. And so to quote from Horwich's article, "The media we use to interact with one another shape the world we inhabit. The advent of reading and writing transformed society. It altered people's consciousness and politics, along with the intellectual feats they were capable of." And so reading isn't just a matter of our own personal enjoyment or development even as people, but rather something that comes to shape the very world we inhabit. Much of the world as we know it has been shaped by the reading that people have done before us, and not just by particular people reading, but by a culture of literacy. She goes on later to point out that the advent of reading and writing were a precondition for philosophy, for modern science, for history as an academic enterprise, and for art criticism. And so many of the disciplines of knowledge that we now have and benefit from have as their foundation the practice of reading and writing. And that's because reading makes possible this higher order level of thinking and comprehension and synthesis that otherwise is very difficult, if not impossible. And so as we read, many of us together, and build what becomes a literate society, it makes possible many of these other goods that come to shape the world that we either get or have to live in. The second big idea, which sort of flows out of the first, is that the goods that we get as a literate society aren't permanent. These aren't fixtures that once we've achieved them, once we have them, they'll just stick around. We won't magically retain our ability for higher capacity or higher order thinking. We won't magically retain our ability to have substantive dialogue and debate, or to have responsible self-governance. As Horwich put it in her article, reading shaped the modern mind. Its disappearance will reshape it. The decline of reading will bring about changes of the same magnitude as those things that we talked about earlier, those positive goods that it has given us. When it disappears, it reverses those. It will affect our innermost thoughts, our society's politics and culture, and how we tell the history of our civilization. And if we look closely, we can see that these changes have already begun. Now, I mostly agree with that paragraph. The one thing perhaps that I would change is that I don't think we have to actually look all that closely to see that these changes have already begun. There are so many illustrations of this, we could talk about it for the rest of the video, but to point to just one, we can look in the world of modern politics. We can look, for example, at a very prominent political strategist who was the political strategist for one of our former presidents, who recently wrote an op-ed in which he counsels how to go about conducting political campaigns. In it, he says, if it can't be communicated in an Instagram post or 10-second TikTok, go back to the drawing board. He encourages politicians to focus on, in those running campaigns, to focus on constant content creation. And what should that content look like? Well, if it can't be communicated in an Instagram post or a 10-second TikTok clip, you need to go back to the drawing board. Whatever you make of that, it doesn't bode particularly well for substantive social debate or the future of our self-governance. In sum, Horwich writes, the decline of reading seems to be ushering in a less rational, less analytical, and less sophisticated mode of thinking. The third key takeaway, and one that I think is the most concerning, is that we are failing to pass the habit of reading along to the next generation. The article, for example, cites a study of 236,000 Americans that finds that only 2% of them read to a child on any given day. And many parents treat reading as an optional form of entertainment to be considered alongside video games and TV and social media. And as a famous headmistress in London once said, this is roughly the equivalent of telling your child that they can eat either vegetables or chocolate chip cookies at any given meal. You don't have to know kids very well to know which one they're going to select. The idea is if you give them the option to do any of these things at any time, whenever they want, kids are not always going to pick what's in their own best interest. And that is why we, as the adults in the picture, have a moral obligation to help them make better decisions. This doesn't mean forcing kids to read or giving them mandated hours of reading every day, which would likely destroy whatever love of reading is naturally in them. Rather, it just means that we treat reading as something that's a normal part of life. It's a normal expectation. Well, of course we're going to read today because that's what we always do. It's part of how we live. The article also cites an authoritative study that found in 2022 that fewer than half of adults reported having read a single book that year. And you may be thinking, what does that have to do with passing down the habit of reading to the next generation? But it matters crucially. We can talk all day. We can tell young people all day that reading is so important and valuable. But when they look around and see us, not with a book, but with our phones, not with a book, but looking at the TV, the message is pretty clear. If we really thought reading was so valuable and important, we'd actually be doing it. The article then goes on to paint a pretty bleak picture of the reading habits of the younger generations. And so, for example, it talks about how the younger generations are reading less than the current older adult generations were reading when they were kids. And so if you look at those adults that we saw a minute ago, fewer than half of them had read a single book in 2022. Well, they were reading a good bit more than young people today are reading when they were that same age. And so the takeaway from all of this, the result from all of this is that if we don't make some changes fast, I think it would be rational to expect that the future of reading is going to get worse. It certainly would get worse before it gets better. The fourth thing that really stood out to me from the article is that the response of the public education system to the literary crisis has been exactly wrong. For example, the article says that more than 80% of elementary school teachers said that students receive a school-issued device by the time they enter kindergarten. The social science on this is unequivocal. This is definitely a bad idea, and we're doing it in more than 80% of the cases. What the studies show is that the use of the presence of screens being used a lot in schools leads to poor outcomes, and yet we are doing it more and more. The article goes on to say that many administrators are instructing teachers not to assign full books to students, but instead to use quick and short reading drills that utilize small excerpts. And why are we doing this? Well, because the goal is to prepare students to perform better on multiple choice exams where they're going to be given a short excerpt and then tested on it. Think about that for a minute. What we're gearing our whole approach in education, in literature, in English, towards is preparing the students to pass multiple choice exams. In other words, we're preparing them to pass tests, not to do well in real life. We're not preparing students to engage deeply with the texts that have literally built our civilization and culture. We're not preparing them to think through complicated arguments and issues like the ones that face us in real life. Instead, we're opting for getting them better at passing exams, because if they pass the exams, we'll get certain marks as a school, and maybe that'll be attached to some sort of funding. And the better they do on the exams, the better chance they'll have of getting into a better school. And the better school they get into, the better their resume is going to look when they get their job, and everything's oriented towards that, as I've talked about in previous videos. The bottom line is that the public school system, instead of looking at schools or educators who are successfully getting their students to fall in love with literature and to become capable of engaging deeply with things that matter, the things that would actually prepare them for real life. Instead of doing that, we're opting for a Band-Aid solution, for something that will just let them pass the tests, just let them pass the tests and get a certain score. And that approach, whatever else it does, is definitely not going to help the literary crisis in America. So are we doomed for failure? Has the death of reading already come? I don't think so. I think we're headed in the wrong direction, and that means we need to make some changes, which is why I want to end this video by talking about some of the things that we can do differently. Specifically, some of the things that regular, ordinary people like you and me can do. People perhaps who are already reading, or at least who see the value in it. So first of all, I'm working on a project right now that you can easily get involved in. I'll be releasing details on that soon, so if you want to be involved in turning the tides in favor of reading, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so that you can see those as they come out. Secondly, if there are children in your life, read to them. Read to them a lot. Try to make it a habit that you do every day. But don't just read to them, read in front of them. Both are important. Let them see that you have your own reading life, that reading isn't just something that's bedtime stories for little kids. It's something that adults do too. Speaking of which, the third thing you can do is cultivate a rich reading life of your own. A reading life that kids will look up to and be excited about. A reading life that they'll admire. A reading life that shows what the goods are that come from it. If you're interested in building a better reading life, be sure to check out my Substack where I help people do just that. I'll drop a link to that in the description. And the fourth thing you can do is to find out if your school district has hopped on the devices bandwagon. Find out if they are advocating for or using this short form content in lieu of assigning actual books to students. And if so, voice your concerns. So those are 4 very practical things that most of you can do. But I'm curious if you have any other ideas on what we can do together as readers to help promote reading, to help turn the tides, because I think that's absolutely possible. Let me know in the comments below, and maybe we can get some ideas going there, some discussion thread. I really appreciate you watching this. I think reading's really important. It's a big part of what the Morning Light is about. And so if you're interested in that, if you want to become a better reader or help other people with that, be sure to subscribe, like this video so that we can reach more people with this kind of content. And you'll see me next time.